bit, the last tail of the evaluation process steps, which is really about the reporting, so moving from findings to conclusions, and very importantly, the last bit on useful recommendations and how to formulate them. So with that, I would like to give the floor to Kwaku to guide us through the first part.
Okay. All right, Hilde, thank you very much. Yes, I'm going to talk to you about how we move from findings to conclusions. You ask yourself, what is actually findings? What are findings made of? How do you move from your findings to making the analysis? And then also, how do you move from analysis to conclusions and the common mistakes that we mostly make when we are drawing conclusions? Hilde, please, the next step.
Yeah.
All right. So to us, we say conclusions are basically the judgments that you make of the findings, after you have done your analysis of the findings. Okay. So basically, findings gives you the actual situation when you went to the field or you spoke to stakeholders, what they told you, that is your finding, from there. So it gives you the picture is of what is on the ground. And then from then you try to, you do your analysis where you try to find the reasons behind the findings. If the project is going well, what is the reason behind it? All the findings that you are getting from the project or program that you are evaluating, what are the reasons behind it? What factors contributed to the achievement of the results that you are getting from the field? And then from there, you draw conclusions from it. You try to make reasonable judgment about the findings. What can you concretely say about the findings that you get from the field? And the question is, what is reasonable judgment? Where we see a reasonable judgment as where you try to, as much as possible, avoid biases, making sure that there are not more of opinions from stakeholders, because you understand that stakeholders have different opinions, different interests, and when you're interviewing them, they want to push it across. So you try to make a judgment or a conclusion that embodies overall opinions of all the stakeholders that you interviewed, instead of being biased towards one person. Next slide, please. Yes, exactly. So yeah, so the question is, what is reasonable judgment, and also how do you come to a reasonable judgment when you are trying to formulate a conclusion? So you basically, in every evaluation, it comes with a criteria, and so mostly the OECD criteria, efficiency, relevance, effectiveness, sustainability, and under each of these criteria, they come with questions. Okay, so you try to categorize your findings based on the criteria that the client gave to you. So you can use a table or an Excel sheet or even a common Word document to categorize the findings that you got, and then try to answer each of the questions that the client is asking you. Make sure they are precise, they are clearly answered in each of the questions. And then when you are drawing the conclusion, we always advise that you make reference to the findings. So this was the finding, and this is the conclusion that I'm making based on this finding, so that it is easier for the client to whoever is reading to relate to what you're talking about. Now back to the reasonable judgment. Like I said, your finding needs to be validated by several stakeholders, not just one person. So there has to be a triangulation of the findings that you do. And then what we always, as MDF, what we mostly do especially during the analysis, if I can take you back, during the analysis stage, is doing what we call sense making. We believe that the findings you get from the field, you as an evaluator, you cannot just sit somewhere and just draw conclusions. After your initial analysis, you bring these stakeholders together. We call it sense-making workshop. Try to make sense together what you have found, and you also make sense together with your initial analysis. Is it the same as they are seeing it? Do they have differences to what you are seeing? How can they help you to make better judgment? So it doesn't come out just favoring one stakeholder or the other. Next slide. Yes, so what we have also realized that the mistakes are made in drawing conclusions. Sometimes they are opinion-based. Like I said, they are based on the interest of one stakeholder. It is something that we need to avoid. Sometimes they are based, there's no evidence backing the conclusions that we are, there's no evidence based on the conclusions that we are drawing. We advise that you avoid that. And then also you need to be, careful and also choose the right type of words in drawing the conclusions. For instance, we say mosquito nets don't work. Fine, but or saying projects totally fail to achieve, so but you need to bring in why you are saying that. Is there a reason for this? Choose the words carefully, but still saying the right thing. And also when you avoid the sensitivities, that is involved in a particular project, make sure you are sensitive to the stakeholders that are working on the project, and then still say what you want to say, but be mindful of the sensitivities that are involved in what you are doing.
Yeah. Thanks, Kwaku. Thanks a lot for this. If you have questions for Kwaku, please use the chat to highlight them. He might respond directly to them in the chat, and otherwise, at the end of the 3 sessions, we have space to discuss them at length. So, Michelle, can I give you the floor for the second session?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, so once you've drawn conclusions, the idea, of course, is to, why we're all here, draw useful recommendations, because we believe that recommendations should be useful, not just draw them for the sake of having them in your report. So maybe, Hilde, you can show the next slide, because of course we can use a definition. United Nations Evaluation Group has a definition. And when you read that, you can notice something particular. Especially the last sentence is about recommendations are intended to inform decision-making, including informing new program design or how to best allocate resources, perhaps how to improve strategies. And it all depends also, of course, on where you are. Are you at a midterm? Are you at an end line? Are you phasing out the program? That all determines what type of recommendations you have to provide to the people you're helping, you're advising. So let's look at that a little bit more into detail, how to make them utility focused. So first of all, still same as Kwaku was explaining, you can also make that people are making mistakes with formulating recommendations. The same like with the conclusions, sometimes recommendations are not clearly linked to the conclusions or the findings. So then it's very hard for the recipients of the recommendations to understand why the evaluator came up with these recommendations. So the key is to always make sure that the logic is flowing clearly in communicating your recommendation, from the finding to the conclusion to the recommendation. This sounds very obvious, but a lot of the times I've read evaluation reports, I've talked to clients, and this is not the case. They're like, why is this recommendation coming up? So pay attention to that. Another common mistake, Hilde, not formulated with practical use in mind. So as we said, recommendations should be useful, they should be practical, they should be viable, feasible. So if you, for example, as an evaluator suggest, based on findings and conclusions, that a project should move to another region, you can only really recommend this if this is a viable solution. Otherwise, you give them an advice that they might not be able to implement. So the sense making comes in here as well. If you have formulated those kind of conclusions, you can come up with a sense-making session that you can test the water to see how this recommendation might be received and if the people you're working with are actually receptive of such an advice. Another mistake that is commonly made is that recommendations are too obvious. Like, for example, the project should follow the project cycle. Most projects start from initiation, formulation, you go to implementation, monitoring and evaluation, and you continue the cycle. This is obvious, but it's not very clear. It's not very precise what you mean. What should the project really do? Where in the project cycle should they perhaps pay more attention to? And that links to actually another example that I have on a mistake, which is that they're overly prescriptive. So if you recommend, for example, in the M&E phase of the project cycle, that the project should improve like formulation of indicators, and you suggest they should do a training for staff on this, this might not be very relevant. And depending on what the client wants to do with this this gap in terms of formulation of indicators that you might have observed through the evaluation. Yeah, so don't be too prescriptive in your recommendations, unless the client really asks to. For example, in our current evaluation, they really tell us exactly what to do, like precisely. How long should our meetings be? How many people should be in it? How long should it take? That level of detail. Sometimes if the client asks for it. Next slide, because these are of course then the tips based on the challenges or the difficulty of formulating recommendation to make them useful. We of course also have tips. As I mentioned in the beginning, the thinking process on recommendations starts from inception. What I mean with this is that in the inception phase, you can already check what type of recommendations the client wants. Is it a midterm evaluation or is it an end line? That will determine what type of recommendations you give. Yeah, for continuation or for phasing out. The same with the purpose. Is the purpose for learning or is it more for accountability? That might shape the formulation of your recommendations. Secondly, the process of formulation, we always, as we mentioned, sense making, we recommend to use a participatory approach to get a sense of what the client really wants. And maybe they come up with their own recommendations together with you in a co-creation process. Of course, it's very key to also explain what the expected benefit or value of implementing a recommendation is. It should flow logically from the findings to the conclusions, but sometimes it's also useful to clearly state, if you do this, if you implement this recommendation, then that will be the benefit. Another best practice is to request for a management response. This is helpful to guide the client to react and commit to certain recommendations. So to ensure that they are actually used and followed up. Followed up can also be done in consecutive evaluations. So if there is a next assessment, it could be an evaluation question that how well did the project implement recommendations previously provided to them. So this way you can make sure that the commitment that a client gives on recommendations are actually also used and implemented. So some tips and tricks, I hope they were useful.
Thank you, Michelle. Can I give Antonia the floor to take us through SMART evaluation recommendations?
Yes. Thank you, Hilde.
Yes.
So SMART evaluations, next slide. We thought it would be interesting maybe to give you some tips on how to develop SMART recommendations. And why smart? So, I mean, for those who are already M&E professionals or evaluators, you know that it's something that we use when we develop indicators, especially, or objectives for a specific program. But we thought, considering the principles that Michele and Kwaku have already presented, the SMART principles can quite well apply to recommendations as well. So next slide. So SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. But what does that mean when we speak about how we make SMART recommendations? So when we say specific recommendations, it's clear that what we mean is that the recommendation should be really clear. There should not be ambiguity in terms of what you are referring to. So the client should understand by reading the recommendation what they're supposed to do with them. And we also say respectful, because I remember, as I said in my introduction, I used to work on the other side. So I used to be a client. And I remember a lot of evaluators would say things like, you must, or you should do that. I think it depends on evaluation, obviously. From my experience, it's always nice when evaluators maybe phrase recommendations, the client should consider this or should explore doing that. Usually the client will accept that a bit more easier because they feel that you know, they're not obliged to do something, but they're just suggested to do something. It's a recommendation after all. So keep that in mind when you write the recommendations. And then something to keep in mind also is that we as evaluators, we don't know everything. In fact, I mean, we might have read all the documents and spoke to a lot of people during the evaluation, but truly the client knows best what their program is about and what the challenges are. We're just giving a lens, a mirror for the client to reflect on, you know, what is not working well and what can be improved. So that means when you write recommendations, you can be specific, but leave some room for fine tuning for the client. Don't be too specific because they know who are the people that can carry on with the recommendation or a specific policy that needs to be developed. So keep that in mind. Be specific, but not too specific to leave room for the client to sort of nuance a little bit. And then it's always important, and many clients actually ask for it, for recommendations to be specific for the stakeholders that are supposed to implement the recommendations. If you have done an evaluation that entails the work that is done by several departments within an organization, and you know that certain recommendations are specific to certain departments, make sure that you mention those in the recommendation so that the client knows who is supposed to do what. Measurable. So obviously, these recommendations are not indicators. So there's not so much of quantitative information when you write recommendations, but when you have the possibility to do so, try to use benchmarks or targets, because then the client will know, okay, what is that I need to achieve exactly? Also make sure that they're balanced and impartial. You know, it's you are an evaluator, so of course there's a bit of a subjectivity when you develop recommendations, but make sure that, you know, you respect the criteria, the evaluation criteria that were set up at the beginning of the evaluation, and that the evaluation recommendations are at the end impartial, respecting those criteria. Also, sometimes clients have what they call management response. So basically, you give the recommendations, Michelle talked about it already, and they categorize them in a management response so that they can keep track on the progress of their implementation. Not all clients have that. So maybe you can suggest the client to do an annual review and see what the progress on recommendation has been. You know, just be creative in that sense. The point is that the client needs to check whether an action has been done on the recommendation at a regular basis. Achievable. I think that's probably one of the most difficult new ones when we develop recommendations, because we know what the gaps are, we know what can be improved, but we always need to keep in mind what is the client mandate and especially the resources. We can't recommend something that is out of the scope of what the client does, and we cannot recommend something that will require the client to acquire a considerable funding that is not in their current funding streams. So if you're doing especially a program evaluation, remember what are the current resources of the clients, what are their objectives, what is that they want to do, and the recommendation that you give are supposed to be relevant to actually, what is their capability at the moment. Don't ask the client to do something that they're not supposed to do, basically. And that links well with the second principle. I've seen, especially when I was on the other side, let's say, sometimes the recommendations would say, the Ministry of X and Y and Z should do this and that, while the client is an implementing agency. So be careful when you develop recommendations in that sense, because evaluators can probably sense that there's a gap in the relationship between the client and a certain ministry or a certain UN agency, but the client cannot change or have a control on what other agencies do. So when you do those recommendations, make sure that you say things like, develop a relationship with a certain ministry, strengthen collaboration with a certain UN agency, so that it's still in the realm of control of the client. Also, when you develop recommendations, sometimes you organize them by evaluation criteria, so relevance, coherence, effectiveness, etc. Sometimes the findings lead naturally to sort of categories of recommendations. I don't know, you're doing a program evaluation and there's a certain number of recommendations about fundraising, about program implementation, about human resources. So these are all categories. Make sure that you limit the number. We can't really say how many, of course, but if you do 20 recommendations per category, that's probably a little too many. So consider to have a good balance between all the categories. Also, when it comes to relevant, it's really important that you make sure the client knows what, according to you, are the most important recommendation they should take on, and what are the most priority one they should address. That is something that you can do quite easily by ordering them when you write the recommendations in the report. Or you can suggest the client to do an exercise where they decide, okay, what is the most important things that we want to tackle? And based on that, then the recommendations will follow and will be relevant to what the client has decided that is most important to them. That can happen at any time during the evaluation process, by the way, and it relates back to what we have just presented. It starts from inception and it ends when you write the report. Also, as I said, we come from an external perspective, so we don't know everything. What we should know, though, is what the client has already implemented in terms of changes or gaps that were supposed to be addressed. That information we should have, because we should not recommend what the client is already in the process of doing, in the process of implementing or improving. We can maybe say that they should strengthen some of these processes, but try not to give recommendations that are already well known and implemented by the client, because then it would not be very useful. As Michele already said, we should always link recommendations to the evidence, so the findings, and the conclusions. So it should be really a logical sequence. It should be a flow. When we read the report, when we read the findings and conclusions, especially, we should already get a sense on what the recommendations what are the elements that recommendation will address. So always make sure there's a link between the two. And then to finish, time bound, well, that's quite important. Some clients would ask that explicitly, some others will not. It's always good maybe to give an indication on whether recommendations you're giving are for the short-term period, for the next few months, or for the medium term, or long-term. Long-term can mean a lot of things. I don't know, it can be, for example, next strategic period or the next program that will be implemented. So not necessarily something the client should do right now, but elements the client should consider when designing a new policy, when designing a new program to be implemented in the future. And that links to my last point, which is, you know, especially when you do MTR, which stands for midterm reviews, midterm evaluation. So you do that at the middle of project implementation. It's very common that you would have recommendations that are supposed to be given to the client, so the client can implement them before the end of the program. While there are some other things that you already know the client will not manage to implement before the end of the program, but you think are important elements for the client to consider when designing a new program, for example, because that's the best time they can actually take those elements into account. When the program already starts, it's already a bit too late, especially for most strategic recommendations. So just keep that in mind. If you can make that distinction, especially when you're doing program evaluations, clients will really appreciate and will make the recommendation useful at the end. We just added at the bottom of the slide 2 suggested reading. Well, one is the UN evaluation group checklist for recommendation. Have a look. It's very simple, but it also helps in understanding, okay, what are the main elements that need to be respected when developing recommendations. And also for all the evaluators out there, I suppose you know Better Evaluation. It's an incredible website where there's a lot of resources. One of those is a checklist about evaluation reports, and there's a section on what should be included in recommendations. It's also very simple. So have a look if you want to have more information on how to make recommendation smart and useful. So that was it from me.